By the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to validate any form in Next.js. Unlike other tutorials that focus on basic text field validation, which is not useful in real-world applications, in this video, I'll show you how to validate real-world forms, including third-party components. This is the only tutorial you'll ever need to do robust validation on any form in Next.js. We'll be working with a real form from one of my projects. This form includes elements like dropdown, date picker, a text input, autocomplete, multi-select, text area, and a URL field. We'll not only handle the form validation errors, but also securing the form against malicious hackers and handle other general errors such as accession, database errors, etc. So without further ado, let's get started. There's a GitHub repository that goes along with this tutorial video. In the repo, you'll find two folders, Start and Finish. Before we begin, let me show you what the finished form looks like so you'll know what we are aiming for in this video. Once you clone the repo, navigate to the Finish folder. Install the dependencies by doing npm install. Then do npm run dev. Open to localhost. By the end of this tutorial video, you'll be able to validate any form in Next.js using Zod, including third-party components and optional fields. If the user provides a value in an optional field, it'll be validated too. Okay, so if I try to submit this form without putting any value, I'm going to get some validation errors. So let me explain. We have this business recall date, which is a date picker. This is only required if the recall type is voluntary. If it is mandatory, we don't need that. So, but the field is there, we're just hiding it. So how we're doing it, this is an optional field, but we're also checking for the format. So if I'm selecting a date here and I try to tamper with this date, I will get an error. But if I put the correct date in there, the error disappears. The product label, I need to put some product. And it needs to be at least 3 characters. So if I try to submit, that error disappears. We are getting this error. We are having this autocomplete drop-down multi-select, but we need to select at least one reason type. So if I select contamination, I can do that, or I can do like safety, and it's going to provide me with autocomplete option, and I can submit. And I try to submit that. Now I want to get errors. For recall overview, I need at least 10 characters. So I will say this product is being recalled due to contamination, right? So if I try to submit, now all the fields are going to be correct and it will allow me to submit the form. But let me show you something else that's very interesting. So if some malicious user tries to tamper with the data, like for example, if I go ahead and if they try to go ahead and make changes to the values like this, and then they select the value and then try to submit it, it's going to throw an error because we're doing like a robust validation for all the fields. We're only expecting voluntary and mandatory values. This text field, which is used for business website, it is optional. It is fine as long as the user leaves it blank, but if they provide a value, we're validating that value. Like for example, if I say coding money and I try to add a recall, it's going to say invalid URL format. So it has to be like a valid URL format, which is going to be https://codingmoney.com. Now, as you can see, this is a valid URL. This will allow me to submit this form. If I select voluntary, I need to provide a date as well. So I can select the date and now I can submit the form. And if I do that, I am redirected to a success page, which is validation successful, and we're able to submit the form. Before we get started, I want to show you what third-party packages I'm using. So I'm using React Date Picker for this date picker right here. And I'm using React Select for this autocomplete multi-select dropdown. And for styling, I'm using the Tailwind CSS. Let me stop my local server and go into the start folder. So the start folder is going to be our starting point for this tutorial. I start my server. In the start folder, npm run dev. Okay, I need to run npm install first. Then npm run dev. So if I start my server with the start folder, as you can see, this is a simple form. And if I click on this button, nothing happens. It's not validating the form input. So we're going to add validation to this form now. Let me show you what do we have in the start folder. As you can see, we've got a simple project setup. The form that you saw on the screen is this component called recall add form. If we scroll down to the form, we have a server action called add recall, which gets triggered when the user submits the form. And each field has this name attribute. Recall, for example, for recall type, we have got this name attribute. We've got the same name attributes for other fields. But for external components like a date picker, what I'm doing here is that I'm using hidden fields. So as you can see, this is not a third-party component. We're having this name attribute. We have name attributes. Here I'm using another third-party component called select. And the way that I'm passing these values is through hidden fields. So let me show you. These are the hidden fields. So as you can see, I have this hidden field called HID base recall date, and then I have another hidden field called HID recall reason type. The value is set as JSON, but I stringify it so that I could use it as value. So when the user fills out the form, let me do that real quick. So if I go ahead, select the date, I do a test product, use something like contamination, recall overview, and when I hit add recall, you're going to see that this server action add recall gets triggered, and it gets all the data from the form. I'm using the name attributes for the fields like that, and I'm getting it using the form data, and I log it in the console. And here, so I get access to the data in the server action. So that's what we have so far in the start folder. There are 3 steps to add validation to this form. We use a package called Zod. Let's talk about Zod. Zod is a TypeScript first schema declaration and validation library. It's perfect for ensuring that your forms have the correct data before submitting it to your backend. So as first step, we'll install and import Zod. So let's do that right now. To install Zod, we'll go into the project folder cd start and then do npm install Zod. It will install the package for us. Then inside the config folder, we'll create a new file called Zod schema.js. We'll import Z from Zod. You'll see Z variable often. It's just a reference to the Zod library. But you might ask, why do we use Zod? It's simple to integrate with Next.js, works great with TypeScript, and gives you immediate feedback if something's wrong with the input. This makes your forms more secure and user-friendly. Step 1 is complete. We installed and imported Zod. Now we'll proceed to step 2. We'll create a schema object. We'll create a schema for each of the input fields. The schema is a set of rules for validating our data. This schema can validate things like strings, numbers, arrays, and more. I have provided you comprehensive Zod schema examples in the GitHub repository for most of the data types along with the examples. Let's create a schema for recall type. We created a schema for the recall type to only expect the values defined in the dropdown. I've imported the dropdown values from the recall dropdown here, and only expected values are voluntary and mandatory. We'll also require the product label to be a string with a minimum of 3 characters using upper, lower, punctuation, dashes, or % sign, but will not allow other special characters. I'll go ahead and code for the remaining fields to save time. Recall overview is similar to the product label. It's easy. I have a recall date regular expression to match the format of the date input. The recall reason type schema is a bit tricky. Let me show you how I did it. I passed the value to the server action as a hidden field in the stringified JSON format I showed you earlier. Therefore, here I'm parsing the value as JSON to make sure the data is valid and it has at least one item in the array. So URL schema is self-explanatory. It checks the value if it is a valid URL. So the business website field, the way that it works, it's optional by default. So if there's no value provided, it's going to be still true. But if there is value, then we'll check to see the value is a valid URL. Here, as you can see, I'm creating and exporting @recall schema object that includes all the fields along with their schema. I've chained a refine method to the schema object. This method has access to the validated data so that we can perform further validations between the different fields. In this case, I'm checking if the recall type is voluntary. Then I'll require the biz recall date and make sure it has got the correct date format by testing it against the recall date regular expression. This path points to the biz recall date. In case of an error, we can provide a custom error over here. So now we have created a schema. We can use it to validate data. We install and imported Zod. We also talk about why we use Zod. And then we also went ahead and completed the step 2. We created our schema object. Now, as a third step, we can pass the input data to the schema validator, a method called safeParse. If the data is valid, we'll get an object with the success property of true. Okay, let me show you that here as well. As a third step, we'll pass the input data to the schema validator, a method called safeParse. If the data is valid, we'll get an object with the success property to true and a data property with the validated information. If the data is not valid, we'll get an object with the success property of false and an error property explaining what went wrong. Now let's validate the form data in our application. If validation fails, we'll show to the user these validation errors in the form and allow them to fix it. If the success property is false, we'll return the errors. If it is true, then we'll process the data. So let's just do that. We'll import the @recall schema from Zod schema. And here we can do const result equal to @recall schema @recall schema dot safeParse. Pass the input data, which is recall data. Recall data is an object that has all of the form fields. And then we can check for if result success is false. I mean, if it's not success. So if the data is invalid, then we'll console.log the result.error. Okay, so let's do that. Let's see what we get. So I'm just going to save it. And what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to go open the form, try to submit the form, and check to see if we get those errors. As you can see, we're getting all these errors, but we're getting the path as an array, which is not showing us the field names. So what we can do is we can flatten this error to show the path. So we can use this flatten and only show the field errors. If you do it this way, you're going to notice it's much better, cleaner. Let me do it again. If I submit the form, you're going to see that it is, we know exactly what's wrong with our form because it's also showing us the form fields. Like for the product label, string must contain at least 3 characters. The recall reason types, you must select at least 1 recall reason type. Yeah, and so you get the field names along with the error. This is much better. So we can return this. Return errors result dot error dot flatten field errors. Okay, so in order to return this back to the form for the user to see, we need to enable the form state. So we need to add form state here. And the way that we will be able to access this error is using the hook called useFormState. So if there are errors, if the data is not valid, then those errors will be returned and nothing else will execute after this return statement. But if this check passes and there are no errors, then we can process the data. But even while processing the data, some errors can occur. Like for example, if we need to check if the user is logged in, then we allow them to submit the form. Or if there is an error while saving the data into the database, we should also be able to communicate those errors back to the user. So to do that, I'm gonna write the code here and then explain it really quick. We'll use a try catch block. And we'll, for example, try to save the data into the database here in the try block. And we'll use the result.data field because we know that result.data contains the validated data, and that's what we can use to save into our database. And I'm going to probably have another video showing you how to do that, but it is beyond the scope of this video, so I'm not going to include saving the data into the database because the video is going to be too long. So inside the try catch, and inside the try, we'll add all the logic if we need to check to see if the user is logged in, or if we want to save the data into the database, and while doing so there is an error. Then we'll catch that error here, and then we'll return that error message. And the way that we can access it is using the underscore form field. So if that's instance of error, if it's something else that we don't understand, something went wrong, then we'll just return, something went wrong. And this is how we'll handle other errors, which is separate from user input, like the database error, or if you need to check the user is logged in. This is how we'll handle those errors. And then we'll do a redirect. So to do that, we use redirect, and then I'm going to redirect to success. And to do that, we'll import this library redirect from Next navigation. Please note that if you put the redirect inside the try block, it will not work, because the way that the redirects work is by throwing some special kind of error, which tells the Next engine to do a redirect. So just make sure you don't put that inside of this try block. So to do a quick recap, we pass the input data through the Schema Validator safeParse function. We're checking if there are errors. If the data is not valid, we return the errors. And then if the data is valid, we do a redirect to a success page. Okay, so the next step is to display the validation errors. So that's going to be step 4, displaying validation errors. We're going to display the validation errors in the recall add form component. We need to use the use form state hook to access the form state containing the validation errors. We'll import the use form state hook from React DOM. Then we're going to use the use form state hook, use form state. We'll pass the action add recall and an object that initializes the form state. We'll specifically set up an empty errors object that will be used to store any validation errors related to the form fields. We'll use array destructuring to extract 2 values from use form state hook. We'll extract form state and action. Form state is an object that holds the current state of the form, including any errors, values of the form fields, and possibly other state-related data. Action is a function returned by use form state that is used to trigger the form submission and handle form state changes, such as setting errors or updating field values. So we'll use this action in place of that add recall. This is the wrapped up version of the add recall action, which will give us access to that state containing the validation errors. Now that we have the form state containing validation errors, we can display them to the user. I'll paste the code snippet to display the validation error for each field and then explain what it does. Recall type, add it below the label. So we're doing conditional rendering. We get access to the error validation errors on the form state and for each field. So for the recall type, it's .recall type, and then we're doing conditional rendering. If there is any errors for recall type, then we display this div with the errors. And then we'll join, since it is the recall type is an array, we'll join it to be a single string separated by comma. And if there are no errors for the recall type, then we'll just display null. We can also do conditional rendering to the dropdown. Like for example, we'll display a border of red around the dropdown. And we're just gonna repeat the same thing for all the fields. We'll just replace this field name, and the rest is basically the same thing. I'll go ahead and add the code for the other fields, and then we'll do a final test. So I've gone ahead and added the code snippets to display the validation errors for the other field, and I've added this code snippet above the submit button to handle general form validation or database errors that we had created in the server action. In our server action, remember we created this underscore form to display other errors, like if there's any issues with saving the data to the database, or if we wanted to check if the user has a session, we'll display all those errors on the underscore form property. So we're displaying the general form errors over here. I'll go ahead and save this file and test it in the browser. So if I go ahead and click the add recall button, I'll get the validation errors for all the fields, right? But if I try to throw an artificial error from our add recall server action, after we fix all of these errors like this, then we'll have this error if there's any issues, like even if the form fields are validated, if there's an issue with saving the data to the database, we'll be able to get the errors displayed to the user like that. We just created a fake error to show how it would look like. So I'm just going to go ahead and comment that out, and our form is validated. That's it. We've successfully implemented form validation in Next.js using Zod. I hope this tutorial was helpful. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more tutorials like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where I'll save the data from this form into a MongoDB database.